So my name is Renee Hobbs. I'm a professor of communication studies at the University of Rhode Island, where I direct the Media Education Lab. My area of expertise is digital and media literacy education, and I have a joint appointment in the School of Communication and in the School of Education. My interests have always been at the intersection of those two fields. The research question that has animated my career is, how do learners learn about and with visual and digital media? My very first research project was interested in how do people learn from television news. And so that was in 1985. So it's been many, many years that I have tried to understand the nature of learning when it comes to mass media of communication with learners of all ages. So I can say I'm more interested in learning than in learners. A website is called the Grandparents of Media Literacy. When I think about theory, I actually think about the legacy of scholars who have contributed to advance my own thinking, right? And after all, that's what theories really are. They're guesses, they're ideas that come from evidence and imagination at that intersection, right? And back in 2015, I think it might have been 2015 or 2014, I wrote this book called Exploring the Roots of Digital and Media Literacy Through Personal Narrative. And this was a book that really tried to look at the theoretical roots of media literacy, which everybody kept asking, what are the theoretical roots of media literacy? And the answer to that question was, it depends. It depends on what your own disciplinary background is, what your own intellectual journey is. And because media literacy is a transdisciplinary field, it means that different people have different theoretical roots. And the way this book worked is that I invited some amazing authors to select a theoretician that had a special influence on them. And I asked them to explain, how does this theorist affect your work in media literacy? So Michael Rob Greco wrote about the influence of Michel Foucault, and Cynthia Lewis wrote about the influence of Mikhail Bakhtin, and Donna Alverman wrote about Simone de Beauvoir, which was really a great surprise because I didn't know how much feminist theory affected her scholarship in media literacy. But once she told the story, it became immediately evident. She's been interested in inequalities around reading and digital new literacies through new forms of online reading. It made perfect sense how that theoretical framework affected her career. I myself wrote about Jerome Bruner. So that's probably the best place to start. When I was 8 or 9 years old, I encountered a curriculum that Jerome Bruner wrote called Man, A Course of Study. It was a humanistic approach to thinking about teaching the humanities to young children using visual media. And there were photographs and video clips and very interesting hands-on activities, very fun activities. And this was thrilling to me as a young child. And only later, so this stuff was hanging around my house because my mom was an elementary school teacher. But the deep humanities questions that underlie this curriculum were huge for me. And then, of course, that really led me to encounter Jerome Bruner's work when I got to graduate school at Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I was there because of Howard Gardner, and Howard Gardner was working on a theoretical concept called multiple intelligences. But what I was really captured with was a philosopher named Nelson Goodman. He was a philosopher of we might call him a semiotician, right? He was really trying to understand how did symbols work for learning, right? And what was the role of symbols and symbol systems in learning? And in the 1970s and 1980s, as television was becoming the dominant medium and print was moving into the periphery. We can now see that very clearly, of course, but at the time, it was not so obvious that this big epistemological shift was happening, right? And so this became very, very interesting to me. And there were a small group of psychologists who were trying to understand that, okay? And so, but for me to explore that, I had to look historically, right? So, and that took me back to Vygotsky. So I got back to education theory through my interest in communication, right? And I think that one of the things that your project is trying to do in its own way is very similar what I was trying to do with this project, right? Was to sort of chart how different paths through theory shape the choices you make as a researcher. Now, these are the grandparents I've identified as important to me theoretically. Well, Seymour Papert, I'm sure you recognize him, the father of constructionism. Constructionism is an offshoot of constructivism, but Seymour Papert's really been important to me, and my book, Create to Learn, is the most recent example of that, right? This idea of media making as a pedagogy, right? Not just as a way to create a product, right? Not just as a production process, but as a pedagogy. So Seymour Papert was important to me. And so you can see Susan Sontag, my interest in visual communication, Paulo Freire, Donna Alverman, obviously around literacy, rethinking the concept of literacy. Albert Bandura, he's influenced a whole generation of us in terms of thinking about social learning, right? Social learning. Vladimir Propp, because my very first deep entree into thinking about media came from he was a Russian studies guy at the University of Michigan. And he taught a course called Russian Formalist Film Theory. And at age 19 or 20, what did I know about Russian formalist film theory? Nothing, right? But what I learned was that film was a medium that had a rich theoretical inquiry around meaning making. How does it happen that we can sit in a theater together and watch flickering, moving images and get meaning from it? How does that meaning get transferred from author to audience? And how come I might sit next to somebody, but we make totally different interpretations of, one key scene? Well, the formalist theorists, the Soviet formalist film theorists, spoke a lot about that. And so my first introduction to theory of visual media came through Propp and the people who were influenced by him in the 19th and 20th centuries. Obviously, Sonia is a grandparent, right? As is Noam Chomsky, and certainly his work on propaganda had a huge influence on my thinking. Edward Said, and thinking about the other and stereotypes, and even Jon Stewart, as is probably evidenced from you in my playful and irreverent approach to, well, almost everything, right? The theoretical roots of media literacy have 6 different themes. And depending on your own background, you are likely to fall into one or more of these themes, right? So for example, Sonia falls very, very comfortably in the dialectic of protection and empowerment, because much of her work is about trying to recognize and identify what are the affordances of children living with online media? And then what are the risks and harms? And boy, she has contributed a lot to that area. But that's really only one of the strands of media literacy theory, right? And so others of us are interested in the relationship between arts and social activism, or this is the semiotician in me, awareness of form, content, and context. These are really important strands in media literacy theory, as is a focus on learning and literacy, as is the idea that learning is not just about the head, right? But about the heart, the hands, and the spirit, right? So all of my interest in constructivism is kind of rooted in this idea that it's not, learning is not just cognitive, right? It's socio-emotional, it's kinesthetic, right? And this issue, the social nature of representation and interpretation, this is a big strand in media literacy, and it's come kind of fully in play really in my work in propaganda. So my understanding of Bernays' theory changed when I came in closer contact with him and could understand it from his point of view. And that's when I realized that most of my encounters with propaganda theory were coming with a very heavy sociological frame, and where the idea of democracy was completely absent. Like it almost was like a shock to me that Bernays said, oh, propaganda can be part of the practice of democracy. And by the way, political campaigns, which are the truest form of propaganda ever created, are all about democracy. It's like, that's how we elect people, right? Through propaganda. So I began to notice that part of my way of managing theory was kind of through juxtaposition and through putting ideas together that might not have been put together before, right? So when, I don't know, it must have been 2007 or 2008, when the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum invited me to come and be a consultant for this exhibit called The State of Deception, which was a exhibit at the museum about the history of Nazi propaganda. Their basic problem that they shared with me was, how do we connect the past to the present? Because everybody thinks the word propaganda just refers to Nazi Germany, just refers to the 20th century. And how do we help the museum goers to understand that there's propaganda all around them? That's a media literacy thing, right? How do we help them learn to apply the past, knowledge about the past, to the knowledge of the present? So that journey from 2007 to, well, the book was published in 2020, so like a 13-year journey, really, it gave me the opportunity to take theories of propaganda and ram them into theories of education and learning. So I brought together my understanding of propaganda with my understanding of learning, and that's how I see that book as a theory building book, in terms of acknowledging how citizenship education uses theories of propaganda, but does it through the lens of pedagogy. New media has changed all of these 6 paradigms that are part of the way I understand media literacy. Let's start with the first one, arts and social activism, right? So because now there are no gatekeepers, anyone can be a propagandist, anyone can send a meme and or participate in a movement, all right, with the use of a simple hashtag, right? So the idea that art is a means to bring people together, to unify them for a cause, is something that we're seeing happening on TikTok, right? On Snapchat, in all forms of social media. So So there's the first one. Arts and social activism is shifted because of the anyone can publish reality, and the way in which influence has always been shaped by arts. Arts and activism are always in this conversation together. That's not a new idea, but new media enable everyone to do that, right? With differing levels of awareness and appreciation and differing levels of social responsibility, right? So awareness of form, content, and context. This is really a fascinating theme that applies directly to new media. My creativity is always in digital environments. My creativity is always scaffolded with templates, and my choices are forced in ways that I'm sometimes aware and sometimes not aware. And kids grow up exercising their creativity within these very tightly controlled platforms that limit their creativity. But what's so interesting is creativity researchers have helped us understand for the last 1,000 years is that creativity is advanced through constraint. So platforms and scaffolds and structures can actually accelerate creativity. Fears get activated at different time periods, and they come to dominate our understanding of what protection and empowerment mean. Fascinating, fascinating. Learning and literacy, wow, there's so much to say there. One of the things that I feel like we're also just starting to understand is, and I'm really lucky to have so many brilliant and talented colleagues who specialize in this, which is, reading on a screen. Because now my students are doing all their homework on their cell phones, right? And so are yours too, right? I mean, all students are doing their homework on their cell phones, right? And yet we teachers don't design for that. We don't take that into consideration. And by and large, we don't muse even about the consequences. And I think from my point of view, new inequalities emerge in relation to the rising dominance of the cell phone, right? The new inequalities emerge around that. Fundamentally, I see new media in a historical conversation with old media. And I don't think it's that productive to set out this new discourses of the new are always problematic in media studies, because we always see how like all media were once new and we were always claiming their revolutionary potential. Then we realized what profoundly negative consequences they had. Then we figured out how to live with them. And that dialectic is really helped by having a deep understanding of history. Sometimes I ask my students to make a timeline of a journey. This is their life. Okay, my grad students are young, right? Only 25 years old, right? What ideas have you encountered on your life journey so far, and why were they important to you? And show me that, and make an infographic timeline, right? With pictures of the books or the films or the whatever, the theoreticians, and then some writing about why they were important and how they intersected. And almost all my grad students discover that in their adolescence, that the major theoretical preoccupation was about identity and representation. And it's like, of course, that makes perfect sense. Look at it. You're growing up in an image-saturated culture. Of course, that makes sense. But then they recognized as they got older, that then they became more interested in ideology. It's like, okay, that makes also perfect sense, right? So we begin to understand that our encounters with theory align with, or may align with, it might not always, but may align with the lived experience of being a human, right? At a particular time and particular place. And even my students are appreciative of the fact, like they talk about things like before the Arab Spring and after the Arab Spring. Like when we were super idealistic about digital media, and now when we see how dangerous it is becoming, and we see how the monopolies are forming again to create new kinds of digital inequalities. So situating how we encounter these ideas in relation to our lived experience developmentally, and then to the time period, because some of my younger students, they don't remember Arab Spring. They were never enthusiastic. They were never idealistic about this medium, right? They've only known it, right, in the recent past, which was always something they felt addicted to in ways that they loved but couldn't fully control. They never remember when it was going to change the world. They didn't live during that period. So anyway, I think those issues about different timelines, the human, the lived experience timeline, the the larger historical timeline, and then when we encounter the moments when we happen to encounter these ideas, which is why media literacy during middle school is so important, right? Because some of these big ideas are really relevant, can be really well understood by kids who can think hypothetically. 11, 12-year-olds can manage a lot of complicated ideas when it comes to media, if we provide the space for that to happen. Creating a new theory or concept is really about trying to look at how the pieces of the puzzle fit together and looking for the synergies between them. Because for me, the propaganda book moved forward when I was able to connect ideas about conditions that support critical analysis, this concept of critical distance, right? With the sort of immersiveness of media production pedagogies, which put you in the position of being the author who has to design the message to try to influence the audience for a cause or a goal that you have, right? So that the idea of helping young people think from the point of view of both the author and the audience, think about the message and the meanings, think about the representation and the reality, right? And so ultimately those 6 ideas, I sometimes shorthand them as AA, MMRR, author, audience, message, meaning, representation, reality. Those are embodied in the conceptualization of digital and media literacy that I developed in 2010, right? So I'm building on that work in this new work on propaganda. So I do think that thinking about it as a process of building that goes on over time, that tries to accommodate your journey of learning along the way, like where you are pulling from different authors and different ideas, and you're trying to create something coherent, right? I think that's how I do it. I think many educators hold on to a theory of learning that goes something like this. I said it, so they learned it. Many of my colleagues at the university firmly believe that transmission model of learning. So what's complicated about problematizing the transmission model of learning for people who have it is that the labels get in the way. When I call it the transmission model of learning, of course you reject it. That sounds terrible. I don't believe that. But then when I say, well, why did you show that YouTube video and then just press right on to the next topic? Why didn't you stop and discuss it, right? Why didn't you ask students to say, well, what did you get out of that? What was the most interesting part? What did you learn? Why don't you ever ask those questions after you screen a video? And they were like, well, because it's obvious what the main idea was. It's like, well, actually that's an assumption that transmission occurred. But we know that learning doesn't happen that way. Learning doesn't happen through transmission, right? So I do feel like the labels sometimes interfere. So I could say transmission versus constructivism, and how different people understand those terms can actually interfere. So sometimes it's best for me to like point out the behavioral evidence of the tacit theory that plenty of my colleagues say they're constructivists, but use transmission style pedagogies. And it's only when you point that out, right? It's only when you like call their attention to it that then they sort of realize the gap. They realize that the tacit theory that they're operating under is not the same one that comes out when they think theory.